What's up, everybody? And welcome in to another Chad Daybell update. In today's video, we're going to focus on who I think so far in this trial was the defense's absolute best witness. Does it mean that they're going to win the case and not guilty across the board and we're not going to have to deal with the death penalty phase of this trial? No, I'm not saying what that means, but this is a very key witness to one of the major charges against Chad Daybell that the defense took, that the state called. And on cross-examination, I believe the defense turned her into their best witness. We're going to go through a chunk of that cross-examination. I want to see in the comments what you guys think about it, and I'll explain why I felt like she was so important. We have to remember that the state has to prove these charges beyond a reasonable doubt, and after this witness, I think they're going to have a tough job with one of these charges. So we knew the coroner was coming, and John Pryor had referenced her many times throughout the trial. And the state just spent a little bit of time with her going through how she got most of her information from Chad Daybell. She didn't do a lot of investigating. She would defer to the person that did the examination after exhuming Tammy Daybell's body. And she didn't have a lot of the information that if she would have had it, she would have looked at this case differently, investigated it differently. And basically now she agrees with the ruling that this was a homicide and not just a death by natural causes. That was basically what the state got out of the coroner, and that's all they really could get, right? She gave an opinion. She admits now that it was probably wrong, and she listened to the person that seemed like they had all the information. Maybe it wasn't right, and especially with all this context, she can understand how all that would change and how we ended up here today. Now, that sounds all well and good, but that's the point of cross-examination, to scrutinize these witnesses, to seek the truth, and to see if the state is really proving these charges or if they're just telling a story. And there's a lot of evidence against Chad Daybell, a lot of evidence. There's a lot of context. There's a lot of phone pinging. There's a lot of things happening where they have a lot of evidence to prove what he did to the kids and maybe even Tammy Daybell and in other conspiracies that he's been charged with. But throughout the trial, I think the best evidence the defense has is this coroner's report and comments and notes about Tammy Daybell. And I think it is very difficult for them to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. If I was sitting on that jury and I was looking at each individual cause, each individual charge, would I be able to find that they proved that he committed this crime against Tammy Daybell beyond a reasonable doubt? And thus far, I've struggled to get there. And after this cross-examination, I think we're even further away from beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, do I think he'll get convicted? Yes. Why? Because when you have the full story and you have the context and all the coincidences and everything lining up so he could be with Lori Daybell, with Lori Vallow alone, just them two, no other wives or husbands or kids or anything, pets, clean couple, no pets, no kids, as he said, when applying or trying to rent a house. Do I think it all lines up a little too perfectly and he's going to end up getting convicted of everything? Yes. That's where I would lean at this moment. But if I was a juror, I don't think I could convict on the Tammy Daybell part. Regardless of the context, those coincidences and the stories, the evidence that's been presented to me thus far has not been enough. And this cross-examination, just this chunk of cross-examination, would give me real reasonable doubt as to whether or not I'm really sure he did this, as opposed to a very strange coincidence. And once this happened, then he had to make sure. I mean, it almost lines up better, again, if we really were trying to split the baby as the defense, which it doesn't help him if he gets convicted on the kids. But once this happened and this coincidence happened, then maybe he forced the rest of it to happen by what he did in conspiring to hurt the kids. Let's listen to this cross-examination together and really listen to the points he gets across with this witness in a pretty short period of time.
Is that right?
Certain medication, yes.
And there's also additional training as well, identifying medical emergencies. But in addition, there's also some training as it relates to death scene investigation. Is there not?
Yes.
So he's getting into her background experience and he says, you have some training on death scene investigation, right? That's your job. You show up when somebody passes. You have some experience there, right? And that's going to help us in this case.
And for 20 years, you had experience doing that, right?
My main concern as an EMT is to save lives.
I understand that, but if the life can't be saved.
By the way, she's not just the coroner, she's also an EMT.
still as an EMT for 20 years, given a significant amount of training about the death scene investigation, are you not?
If we can't save the patient before I was coroner, then no, I didn't. We would leave the scene.
Now, when you spoke with the FBI, including attorneys, you said something about
So she said yes, that she had that experience, and then kind of backtracked it a little bit.
a 2-day seminar. Is that right? Some sort of
In
2-day training?
Boise. In Boise, yes.
And then you said there was some other classes or some other issues, right? That you
Uh,
took?
There's a week-long conference, and it's about 4 days, but yes, it's a week long in Las Vegas, Nevada,
And
every
that's what I was
year.
curious about, because you mentioned something about something else, but when you talked to the FBI, you described it as a week-long conference with the FBI as part of your training, right?
Right.
Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And what areas did that cover as part of that week-long conference?
Causes of death, times of death. It covers a wide variety.
It's an extensive course,
Yes, it was my first time attending too.
and is it required as part of being a coroner? Isn't that one of the requirements that you have to go through that training in order to be either elected or appointed as a coroner of a county?
Yes.
And you have to get this extensive training because we're not dealing with a minor issue. We're dealing with making a significant determination of the cause of death of somebody, aren't we? Ma'am?
Yes.
Okay. And are you familiar with Title 19, Chapter 43 of the Idaho Code?
I don't recall.
Judge, would there be something that could refresh your recollection if I showed you something?
Lawyers love to throw out codes or statutes that, an experienced expert witness should know. And then it makes them look like they don't. And it looks like the lawyer knows more in front of a jury when in reality, most people don't memorize every single number or word or letter in the code, but they generally know what the rules are. They have studied them. And if you refresh their recollection, they can then speak intelligently on it. But sometimes it's a strategy that works in front of a jury.
Sure. Yes.
We'll talk a little bit about it.
What
She's
statute
refreshing
are you
her
having her review?
recollection here.
Judge, I have another copy if I would like, I could provide it to the court.
Fine, I have it.
Now, you've read Title 19, Chapter 43 of 01 of the Idaho Code. Is that
Objection, Your Honor.
Grounds?
This witness is not qualified to give she has no legal expertise to be interpreting statutes for the jury.
Well, if it calls for a legal conclusion, I'll sustain it, but I don't know what the question is yet, so overruled for now.
Now, ma'am, did you have an occasion to read
Meaning
that?
she can't say legally this is how it works, or this is what the legal standard is. She can't give that opinion. But after refreshing her recollection, if he wants to ask her how it applies to her work or her experience or expertise, then he's allowed to do that. So the judge is saying, I need to wait till I hear the question before I sustain or overrule an objection.
That as part of your responsibilities of becoming a coroner?
When I first took over as coroner, yes.
Right. So you're aware that your primary job as a coroner under this particular legal statute of the law is when a county coroner is informed that
Objection, Your Honor. This is calling for a legal conclusion.
it's not, Judge.
Overruled.
When a county coroner is informed that a person has died, the county coroner shall investigate the death. You read that first line, right? You're aware of that, right?
Yes.
You are under a legal obligation under the law as part of your position to investigate any death, correct?
Yes.
And if that death,
And that's not a legal conclusion. I mean, maybe a borderline's on a legal conclusion, but if that's your job and that's your expertise, you absolutely should be able to know that and answer that question. You should know what your job is, especially when in the statute it says shall. Shall is must. We've talked about this a lot. When writing rules and drafting statutes, lawyers pick words very specifically. And if they pick a shall or a must, it has to happen that way. If it's a may, then it may not. If it's a absolutely can't happen, shall not, then they can't do it. So those words are very important. So she has to know if it calls for it, she shall investigate. So why didn't she hear? You're starting to figure out where we're going here with John Pryor.
with suspicious or unknown circumstances.
I'm going to
that
back it up
subjugate
just so
any-
we can
you're
get
aware
the
of that, right?
full
Yes.
effect of that.
You are under a legal obligation under the law as part of your position to investigate any death, correct?
Yes.
And if that death was suspicious or unknown circumstances, that's sub B, or the death occurred as a result of violence, whether by homicide, suicide, accident, you are required to investigate, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
So if there's suspicions around it, or if you think it's homicide or by accident or suicide, then you shall investigate.
And then as a result, if you determine that there's an issue, you can require an inquest to be conducted, which is basically like a jury trial, right? You understand that?
Yes.
Okay.
So knowing what an inquest is, okay, whatever, but you can do something. You notice the difference in the language. You shall investigate, and if you want to, you can pull people together to help figure this out. So that's the difference right there in that statute, which lets you know it was intentional that the shall was there for a coroner to investigate.
And you are also to notify the police if you have any, before even doing an inquest, if you have any concerns under the statute that there's anything suspicious or out of the ordinary, you are to notify the police department and ask them to conduct an investigation. You understand that as well?
Yes, and we did have an officer on scene that helped investigate this. And we have an officer respond to every death call that helps investigate.
And I appreciate that, ma'am. But in talking to the prosecutor, you talked about, well, the lapidity caused me some concern. Remember you said that about lapidity, that was a concern?
So Lupidity, basically what they did on um, uh, direct examination was that the body was moved, and they also talked about pooling of the blood, how she was laying on her back for a long period of time. So they did get into certain instances that would make you think that maybe something happened other than natural causes, even though Chad Daybell's story about falling out of the bed, moving her back into the bed, theoretically could have been taken as moved. And then when he moved her back in the bed, she was laying on her back, things like that, which could explain it. But she was trying to use some of these terms later when talking to the prosecutor now to act like, yes, it lines up with homicide that Chad Daybell did this to Tammy Daybell. But now John Pryor is going to say, well, let's talk about that a little bit.
Concern of yours, and your questions weren't answered, right? Well, at the time of the scene there, you said, you noticed lapidity in the body, that Tammy Daybell apparently had died on her back, right?
Right.
Okay.
Yes.
Was that of a concern of yours at the time that would cause you to say, maybe I ought to take a step back before I sign this death certificate?
At that time, no.
Okay, but you were fully aware of the lapidity that you're claiming had occurred at that point. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. There were no fresh bruises on Tammy Daybell's body anyway.
So he's saying you're making this big deal about it now when you and the prosecutor are sitting here talking about it, but you knew that back then. And you didn't think it was suspicious. You didn't think that made it a homicide back then, but you're trying to use it now to say that it's a homicide. And now we're going to get into the fresh bruises versus old bruises, which has been a very important part of John Pryor's opening statement and a lot of his cross-examination, that these were old bruises. There weren't fresh bruises here. And there's conversations about how she was clumsy or bruised all the time. So that's all lining up with exactly what Chad Daybell said.
Where were there?
On her arm, yes.
Those were fresh bruises?
I don't know. I'm not qualified to.
Well, you did
Like
a
that.
you did a report in that regard, did
I'm
you not?
sorry I'm pausing it so much because this stuff is so important. And John Pryor's doing a really good job here, regardless of what you think of his demeanor, what you think about how he's handling the case as a whole. I backed it up a little bit because in this line of questioning, he's saying, we're going to talk about old bruises. And she's like, okay, you didn't see any fresh bruises, did you? Yes. You did? Where? On her arms? They were fresh? Well, I don't know how old they were, but you just said they were fresh. But guess what? In your report, you said they were old, and we're going to get there and impeach her immediately sitting right here on the stand in front of the jury, real time. And I think this is not good for the prosecution when it comes to Tammy Daybell. Now, will it matter at the end of the day because they have such a good story, so many dominoes, so many coincidences that he probably did this? He probably did this to Tammy Daybell, but I just don't think the state has proved it beyond a reasonable doubt to this point.
At that time, no.
Okay, but you were fully aware of the lapidity that you're claiming had occurred at that point. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. There were no fresh bruises on Tammy Daybell's body anywhere, were there?
On her arm, yes.
Those were fresh bruises?
I don't know.
There were no fresh bruises on her arm. Yes. They were fresh. I don't know. You just said they were.
I'm not qualified to.
Well, you
Like that.
did a report in that regard, did you not?
I did, and it looked like an old bruise to me. And with
That's we'll get to that.
So she admits in her report it looked like an old bruise. Literally 2 seconds ago, you just said it was a fresh bruise. This witness, I feel bad for her because, again, she was wrong about the call that she made. And I get it. You just have to eat that and you have to move on. But now it feels like she's really trying to press, forcing like she knows, and all these things point to the fact that it was a homicide when it's pretty clear that they didn't at the time. If it was obvious, then she would have seen it, done something about it, investigated it. But she didn't, which is basically just that based on what I saw, it wasn't obviously a homicide. With more information, more facts, more context, then it obviously became a homicide. That's what I wish if I was the state that she would have done.
So when you filled out your medical report, you specifically not only identified that she had bruises on her arm, you actually used the word old bruises. Do you remember that?
yes, I did.
And these were not fresh or red or irritated or anything like that, correct?
Objection, Your Honor. The witness has already indicated she's not qualified to determine that.
Well, based on our observations all over,
These weren't fresh bruises, were they, on her arms? These were old bruises, just like what your report says, correct?
I can't answer that.
Okay. But you will answer that on your report, when you decided to fill out a report relating to this case, that report said old bruises. When the picture of the body, you wrote on the arms, old bruises on the arms, right?
Yes.
You just have to say yes to that. You already wrote the report. Be like, when I saw it at the time, I thought they were old. I'm not positive, but I thought they were old. You just have to eat that. Like, that's what I don't, when clients or witnesses or anybody comes tell me and they try to like fix their testimony or make it sound better, I'm like, there's really only so much you can do with that. A, the truth is the truth. B, you've already explained it like this. And if it's still technically true that at the time I thought they were old bruises, that's okay. We'll live with it. We'll move on. We'll keep going. But that stuff's going to happen. And to try to do what she's doing here, I think makes her less reliable as a witness in front of the jury.
No other bruises on her body anywhere else, right?
No,
Nothing else that would deem to be suspicious on her body, correct?
No.
And in fact, there was no indication of any trauma to the neck that you could observe, right?
No.
There were no scratch marks on her hands that would indicate any kind of a struggle, correct?
No.
Like, he's on a roll now, and he's saying all this stuff like no fresh bruising around her neck, no scratch marks, no signs of a struggle. The new cause of death was homicide by asphyxiation, I believe. So what signs of that do we have?
There was no irritation on her ears or her face or her head that would give you any indication that there was any kind of a struggle. Is that right?
yes,
When you arrived, Chad Daybell was distraught, wasn't he?
yes,
Sobbing.
yes,
And you noted that it was his son that was not upset. His son was, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but would you say his son was reserved?
yes,
Quiet.
yes,
And in the FBI report, you mentioned that you think that maybe his son was in shock. Remember that?
yes,
Okay. And it's still your assessment at this point that at the time you felt that his son Garth was in shock. Is that right?
yes,
Okay. You went over to the nightstand, and on Tammy's side of the bed, you found the essential oils, right?
the book,
The what?
the book
The book.
of essential oils of natural.
Did you see any? I would represent you that Officer Greenall testified that she found a number of items in the bedroom. And you also saw cough medicine on Tammy's side. Is that right?
I don't recall the cough medicine being in the bedroom.
Okay. What about the medication for strike? What about the medication for bruises that was in the bedroom as well? Do you recall that?
No,
Okay. But if Officer Greenall was there, right?
yes, she
And
was.
detailed that in her report, correct? Correct?
I don't recall.
Okay. Would it help you to review Officer Greenall's report?
Yes,
Judge, if I could just have a moment.
So they take a long break here and they end up taking the morning break to go through the report because he's now going to ask her questions about what the officer found to impeach more of her testimony, to make her even more of a defense witness as the cross-examination continues. So we're going to skip through this break here. So after the break, once she's had a chance to review some of the reports, she comes back up and they start discussing more about the lividity and other reasons. I think I may have said lupidity. I think that's what John Pryor was saying. These medical terms, we always mispronounce them, but it means the same thing basically. And they get more into that and even more into how information that she tries to use to point to Chad Daybell, she already knew and didn't think pointed to that until other people got in her ear, basically.
If Tammy had died in the bed and had passed away in the bed, this lividity would be consistent with her dying in bed on her back, right?
yes,
And if she fell down, and that's what woke Mr. Daybell up, there wouldn't be lividity up in her head, would there?
No.
So when Mr. Daybell told you that he was awoken when he pulled the covers, rolled over, and Tammy slid off the bed, well, that's consistent with the lividity here. She was in bed, she died in bed, and when he pulled the covers, she slid off. So wouldn't his story be consistent with the lividity findings that she actually was in bed for 5 or 6 hours?
yes.
Okay, thank you. Now I want to go over
So
to the
Chad Daybell's story,
and
Chad Daybell's story and what he said lines up with the objective evidence that you found in this case. That's important.
the one that's facing. And on that particular one, it says something about tinged.
So what this diagram is of when she reviewed the body when they went to the Daybell residence, she made markings of the markings she found on Tammy Daybell and put them into her report to memorialize them. Okay, so if she found cuts, bruises, whatever it may be, she would have delineated that on this diagram, where they were, how big they were, things like that. So that's also what they're talking about here.
Foam. Could you read that for me?
Blood tinged foam.
Okay, and that's what you observed on her body was and we saw the pictures of the blood tinged foam in her mouth, correct?
Yes.
Okay, and then further down on what would be her right arm, you put two words there. And what are those words?
Old bruising. Old bruising.
Okay, so old bruising. Now,
He got her to say it twice, of what she wrote down when she put the marks on her arm: old bruising.
you didn't put new bruising, did you?
No.
You didn't put any marks on anywhere else on her body, right?
No.
And as part of your investigation, you by statute are required to do a thorough investigation of the body. Is that right?
Yes.
And you did that day, didn't you?
Yes.
And what you came
And he's adding in words of thorough investigation of the body and things like that. But she shall investigate. She must investigate. And those are the only marks she put there. So he's doing a good job of showing the objective evidence, the state's evidence lines up with what Chad Daybell said happened.
came up with is that she has some foam in her mouth and there were some old bruises on her right arm. That's what you came up with, right?
Yes.
And you came up with nothing else on her body that showed any indication of any other trauma, marks?
No.
We could take that one down. I'm done with that. And Judge, at this time, I'm going to want to publish defensive.
So then he goes through and talks about how the stomach contents, Daybell said she threw up. The coroner said there were still contents in her stomach. They quibbled about whether it was full or whether there were contents in her stomach. And then they go through, I think it was Raynaud's report about the medication that she found, the homeopathic stuff. And then I want to jump to when they discuss originally what she found to be the cause of Tammy Daybell's death and why, and then why that changed.
Seizures based on the fact that those bruises were or anything like that. Now, that all changed though, right?
Yes.
Based on seizures, based on the fact
Sorry.
we previously talked about a temple, and that's somewhere, I guess, where you practice your religious faith.
Yes.
And during that time while in the temple, she fainted while she was kneeling down, right?
Yes. When she went to stand up. Yes.
Right. And there were other instances where she was having health issues and balance problems as well that were vaguely referenced in the report, right?
Yes.
So based on the fact that she had seizures, based on the fact that those bruises were nothing new or recent, there was nothing on her neck or face that indicated that she was smothered, choked, or anything like that. You made the determination that there was a medical reason for why she passed away, correct?
Yes.
So he says there was no indication of struggle, asphyxiation, anything being put over her head, around her neck. So that's why you came to the conclusion that there was a medical reason for her death. And she says, yes. If this was just a trial about Tammy Daybell, I actually think Chad Daybell might win. Now, if you can't make that joke anymore. I was going to say, if my dog was a cat, he'd be a cat. I'll just go with that instead of the joke I was going to say. But, ifs are really important. And this is, in fact, not a trial just about Tammy Daybell. But this cross really sheds a lot of light on the state's burden. And can they actually hold the burden for each individual charge? I understand how sad it is. I know what we all believe probably happened and likely happened, but the state has to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. And that's really what this video is here to highlight.
Now, that all changed though, right?
Yes.
And then at some point, you received a call from some police officers in Arizona, right?
Yes.
And they said, hey, we got this situation with Lori Vallow, right?
Yes.
And we got another situation with Lori Vallow and Alex Cox related to the name Brandon Boudreaux, right?
Yes.
And the first situation was with Charles Vallow, right?
Yes.
Did that officer happen to tell you at that time that Chad Daybell isn't implicated or involved in any criminal proceeding against either of those folks? Was that told to you at that time?
Yes, Chad Daybell's name was mentioned with Lori Vallow.
Yeah, but did they happen to tell you that they're not pursuing any charges against Mr. Daybell at that point?
No.
Okay, so that was left out when they talked to you about looking into this thing, right?
So what changed? Well, she got a call, some stuff going on in Arizona, more context, more issues, more wild parts to this wild story that we've all heard over the last few years. And she starts thinking, holy cow, this all makes sense. I bet this was part of it too. And that caused her to dig back in. And as he's going to go into here and cross, try to find reasons and ways to connect Chad Daybell to Tammy Daybell's death. And he says, and the funny thing is, prior, knowing how all this went, is saying things that obviously sound the best for his client. But he's like, did they tell you they're not pursuing charges for Chad Daybell? She's like, no, because when they originally talked to her, they probably were planning on pursuing charges against Chad Daybell for Vallow and Boudreaux, but they decided not to for whatever reason. Maybe they didn't think they had enough evidence. But that context is what changed it from being a medical reason for her death that was not a homicide to additional digging, no pun intended, that turned this into a homicide that we're here about today.
Yes.
And then at that point, based on your previous observation of foam in the mouth, right?
Yes.
And the lividity, right?
Yes.
And what those police officers told you when you had your discussion with them, right?
Yes.
At that point, you decided maybe I need to look into this thing a little more, right?
Yes.
And at that point, you helped with the officers getting an order to exhume Tammy Daybell's body.
Yes.
Did you start an inquest for statute into this matter?
I, I, I can't answer that.
Well, you can, because did you start an inquest? You read the statute. If there's an allegation someone has been murdered, homicide, suicide, you have the option to start a public inquest.
Hold on before you answer. Grounds.
Counsel should not be interpreting the law at this point, and I don't know if she's able to draw a legal conclusion.
It's a yes or no question, but to the extent it's calling for any legal conclusion, it's sustained.
Okay, well, yes or no? Did you start an inquest?
No. No.
Instead, what you did is you started working with the police officers and the prosecuting attorney.
Objection argumentative.
Sustained.
At this point, you then notified the police that you wanted her body dug up, right?
It's clear what Pryor's doing here. You are then going to start working with police to turn this into a homicide, whether it was or not, forgetting about what you determined in an unbiased, without any other shade or coloring on this investigation when you looked at it the first time. You just throw all that out because now you want to be in on whatever's happening with Chad Daybell and Lori Vallow.
At that point, we were working with the FBI and
Okay.
police from different locations. Yes.
So the FBI was involved as well, right?
Yes. I
Okay.
believe so.
And at that point, there was an order to have Tammy's body removed from the ground, right?
Yes.
Now, as part of your your duties as a coroner, isn't it true that you're also supposed to notify families in regards to any death or suspicious death and let them know what's proceeding in these matters?
I believe that was done.
It was done?
I believe it was.
So she didn't really answer the question. She just says, I believe that was done. Well, we know John Pryor definitely doesn't think it was done. He talked about it in opening, and we're going to hear from Daybell's family. And earlier in the cross-examination, he was saying things like, you knew Tammy or Tammy's family didn't want her to be all cut up and things like that. And she basically said yes. But it was up to her as to whether or not they were going to do the autopsy. And she decided not to at first. And then later she decided to exhume the body without telling the family.
Do you know what family members they happened to mention that to, that they were digging their mother out of the ground?
I don't recall which ones. No.
Okay. And it was your duty to do that. So you don't recall your duty of having to notify them that they're digging their mother out of the ground. Right?
I work closely with the investigators
Okay.
through the sheriff's office, our detectives, and
And I didn't ask you about what you did with the investigators, ma'am. I asked you whether you told the family you were digging their mother out of the ground.
No.
Was there any other reason you were looking for what a reason for why Tammy Daybell could have died other than what you said about the lividity or anything else? Was there any other suspicious circumstances you were looking for?
at the time of her death, no.
And at the time of digging her up, were you looking for something else?
Yes.
What were you looking for?
Suspicious activity, anything that would result in homicide.
Okay. And that was after talking to the police. You
They were looking for anything that would result in homicide.
were looking for information that would help maybe convince you to change your report to something other than natural causes. Is that right?
After several things happened, yes.
Well, I'm not talking about Brendan Boudreaux or Charles Vallow. We've already established what that's all about. I'm talking about the facts you had when Tammy Daybell was put in the ground. It was lividity, and that really was it, wasn't it?
No, I was told about her past health history,
Okay.
and that played into her cause of death. Yes,
Did you happen to look at a Teton medical report and see what her past medical history was?
I did review it.
Okay.
Yes.
So then you're well aware that Tammy Daybell had a history of anemia, right?
Past history, not current.
Right. Well, she wasn't being treated because she wouldn't go to the doctor for anemia.
Past history, now current. If you really want to get into it, I mean, when you have something a week ago, that's considered past history. If you have a surgery a month ago, it's past history, but it's still something you're dealing with. So if you really wanted to quibble, I'm glad he didn't, because it probably just would have come off bad. But it definitely seems like she's pressing to try to, create some good evidence for the state, when in reality, this is a tough spot in the trial for them.
To see any indication that she had been cured of anemia, right?
It just stated her past medical
Right.
history.
And based on your information, there's no indication in any single medical report that, amazingly, Tammy Daybell has been cured of her anemia, right?
No.
Okay. You also saw that she had a family history of heart disease and heart problems as well, right?
Family history, yes.
Yeah, family history, right?
Yes,
And you're also aware that Tammy Daybell had a difficulty with going and seeing doctors, correct? She didn't like to see doctors, did she?
correct.
In fact, she relied on homeopathic essential oils and minerals to solve her medical maladies, right?
That's what I was told, yes.
Right. Okay. So based on the other information that you had about Tammy's history, you decided that even though there's anemia and there's a past history of heart disease and heart issues in the family, we were still going to dig her up, right?
Yes,
And
Yes.
would you agree with me, ma'am? You were basically going on a fishing expedition looking for a reason to change.
Objection. Argumentative, Your Honor.
Sustained.
You were basically
Now, he asked this question a couple times. The jury hears it. The jury gets exactly where he's going, even though he doesn't end up asking it because of all the objections. But you get the point. They dug her up. He's saying it's for a fishing expedition just to find some way to make this a homicide when she already made the decision that it wasn't. And nothing really changed. The lividity and all that stuff was already there the first time she looked, and none of that indicated homicide before. So why does it now?
looking for some reason to dig Tammy up and try to come up with another cause of death, right?
Objection again. Argumentative, Your Honor.
Sustained. Ask a question, please, Mr. Pryor.
So then he moves on. And that basically ends up being the end of the cross because he says you attended the autopsy in Utah, somewhere in Utah. And the state gets back up, tries to rehabilitate, tells them again that, Chad Daybell's the one that gave you all this information. And you were relying on Chad Daybell. And, was he really that sad compared to Garth and things like that? But then when it came down to the ultimate question, okay, why did you change it from just normal medical reasons to homicide as the coroner when this is your job to figure out and put down the cause of death? What happened to make you change it? This is like the final question on redirect with the state up there, with the state's own witness. And listen to her answer. This is what we're going to end on.
And again, you've already testified about the reasons for your change in the admitted certificate.
yes,
And that was based upon you being at the autopsy.
Judge asked and answered.
I'm just,
Overruled. Go ahead.
you already explained you attended the autopsy.
yes, I did.
Is there anything else as you sit there today that you can explain to the jury that you learned from that autopsy experience that helped support your decision to change the death certificate?
This is your chance. Anything you learned at the autopsy that can help you. Now, it can't be what the medical examiner told you. That's hearsay. So what is it?
The expertise of the medical examiner and the investigation.
So what all changed your mind? The expertise of the medical examiner was one.
Medical examiner and the investigation that was going on into other deaths and
Expertise of the medical examiner, investigations going on into other deaths. Okay. I'm not sure how that changes, the objective findings you have here and turn it into homicide. I get context. I get the story. I get how it all makes sense. That shouldn't be enough to convict somebody beyond a reasonable doubt.
Anything further? Anything else? Your Honor, I don't have any further questions.
Judge, there were some new subjects.
That's on 1.5 times speed. Those long pauses. And that's what she comes up with. Why she changed it. Explain. You were at the autopsy, the expertise of the medical examiner, and the investigations into other deaths. That's what they end with as the punch. Pretty wild to me. And again, this I think is a really tough charge to prove based on what they have and based on what happened first in this case. And sometimes it happens like that. And it's sad and it sucks. And sometimes it prevents justice from happening because some people make mistakes or don't do a thorough enough investigation or whatever it may be. But we still have to protect the rights of criminal defendants and hold the state to their burden. So I personally thought this was pretty wild. I thought it was really interesting to see, the difference in evidence depending on the charges that they have and what'll happen when the jury comes back. I can't wait to read your comments and see what you thought about all of this. So make sure you let me know in the comments. Make sure you guys hit that like button and subscribe to our page as well. And let me know if you want me to continue covering this trial. It seems like you guys are interested in it. And as long as you are, we will keep an eye on it as well. That's all I got this time. Till next time, I am out of here. Thanks for watching another episode of The Lawyer You Know. If you enjoyed the episode, please hit the thumbs up and share with your friends who may be interested here on YouTube. And don't forget to subscribe. You can also follow us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and TikTok. And don't forget to check out the Lawyer You Know podcast with new seasons dropping every quarter. If you have a case you want to talk to us about, if it's a personal injury case, wrongful death, catastrophic injury, car accident, or slip and fall case, please email us at lawyeryouknow@gmail.com. And of course, all these links I just mentioned are included in the description below on this episode and every episode. So until next time, this is Peter Tragos, the Lawyer You Know.